athletes start at different ages. There are some who start at 5, 8, and then there are some like me who start at 20. So, that being the case, is there a difference that you have noticed in the way they accept success and failure, or does it pretty much remain the same?
Okay, so there is definitely a age component to how a person perceives their performance. Um, Literature definitely suggests that it's not a good idea for a young child under the ages of 7 or 8 to kind of start with the specialization of a sport. So it's a good idea that they get their hand at every game that they can play, or they get comfortable running, they get comfortable swimming, and so on. So they get like an overall athletic endurance that's going by. Putting or specializing at that age is not very good for the child's mindset, because very quickly we're putting the child into very higher expectations that at that developmental age the child is not yet ready for. We can talk about specializing into a sport, but at that particular age it's a good idea for them to kind of get to explore the field, and they choose which is the one they'd like to pursue and so on. So after the age of 8 to about 10 or 11, then we start narrowing on the options of what is it that they'd like to perform for a longer period of time. If there is a strategy like this in place for an athlete, very often they'll learn to enjoy the game, and at the same time the initial skill sets that they need to learn will become more intrinsic. Like it just happen as a part of them engaging with it, practicing with it, enjoying the whole experience and so on. Then once they come into their 10, 11, or even their early teenage years, then they can start focusing on specific skill sets that come into it, and they can manage that level of added pressure that comes alongside of it. So it helps with an overall and a gradual and healthy development of the child in the performance-based spaces. What it does do is that if a child is thoroughly enjoy the game, taking their enjoyment or reducing the enjoyment and focusing a little bit more on trained skills might be a little bit of a learning curve for the child. So there might be some more resistance over there. There might be a lot more rebellion that might happen, and then slowly the child naturally transforms into it. So it's a milestone of sorts. So that is one look into it. If there is an athlete who has started later, like later teenage years, college, university, and stuff, they would take up the sport with the enjoyment, but they also have a certain degree of maturity to be able to handle the cognitive pressures that come alongside of it. But it's a different set of anxiety that comes for a player who is starting later in the career, is that have they lost time? Am I starting very late? You'll see either depending on the age of onset of for the player, they might notice people who are younger than them might perform a little better and so on. Depends on the sport, depends on the region and so on. So there is a bit of pressure of feeling that they're out of time. They should have started earlier, and conversations with the families also can get a little different in that sense. The other measure that tends to cause a little bit of concern for the athletes who start later is that they don't have a point of comparison to measure what their performance is versus their earlier performance. So some aspects like endurance, stamina, flexibility of the body might be a little bit more restricted depending on the age of starting of the athlete. So it depends on which kind of sport that they're taking. In those spaces, it might affect the performance a little bit. So both these style of playing can affect the longevity of their career. So it's important that when the person has decided that they want to take something professional, they want to take the game professional, it's important that they have a framework in place where they can put down different aspects of the performance. They have an objective measure to see what all they need to work on to perform better.
But let us get to reality.
Yeah.
This is, like you said, literature suggests.
Yes.
But the reality in India is, if you can achieve all your milestones in sport by the age of 14, especially it's very prevalent. It was very prevalent predominantly in cricket, but now I think it's spread to almost every sport. You see somebody at 16 and 17 actually making money having taken up the sport. So the motivation with which parents come in, they all start off saying, you know what, ma'am, I want my child to enjoy the game. 1 month into it, the improvement seems to be very slow. And today, it feels like in India, the faster you achieve, the more glory you are likely to get.
I think that's true I think it's just a cultural thing. Where we're always looking at the shortest route to success. But when it comes into a performance-based profession, there is an individual capacity that most people tend to undervalue to some extent. We're always in comparison to saying, okay, child A performs this way, child B performs this way, and in comparison,
there is a direct, there's a biological age correlation comparison that they have. Correct. Without looking at the skill factor.
Exactly. So that is more for the lack of awareness more than anything else, because sports itself is now only picking up in a country like ours. So what does it take to peak performance? What does it take to maintain a certain degree of performance? The learning is just happening. So that our assumption that if a person is good enough, so therefore they'll continue to be good enough forever is a myth that needs to be broken at some point. So hopefully people are starting earlier. I think there is more effort put into spreading that awareness, but I think it will take a while before we catch on to that, right?
Because I've noticed many players who play age group cricket don't translate that into anything significant when they get into their late teens, when they actually need, when they're stronger physically,
right?
They just fizzle out. They've done all the hard work till they're 14, 15,
right?
And then because it seems to them that that's the ultimate aim. Every time I'm going to use cricket as a comparison because that's exactly where we are every single day. There's an under 12 age group, there's an under 14 age group for boys, there's an under 15 age group, that's where women start off. It feels like both, because of the pressure that the player has, it could be from parents, it could be from coaches, that their focus is on this, that the larger picture very often just goes out. And then the talk becomes very intense and saying, I have invested so much on you. So now this player is caught between the devil and the deep blue sea.
Right.
Do I pursue it? I've lost interest in it. Do I have to pursue it? Or do I'm actually not as good as the others are in my age? Because the players also tend to notice, we've got very smart kids playing around. They notice that compared to their skill set levels that they had at 14, with that of a kid who did not maybe do so well there, but has evolved into a better, more skillful player. But there is so much, like you said, culturally, it works against them. So for parents who feel that that's the ultimate achievement, or the coaches that feel that that's the ultimate achievement, how do we get them out? I know it's not an easy thing for you to say, but is it possible for them to understand that that is not exactly where their focal point should be? Because when I say to parents, they feel that I lack motivation or something. They don't realize that I'm looking at it as a long-term aspect for them.
Right.
But the short-term gains seem to far outweigh a long-term.
We're very used to analyzing success based on outcomes. So if the outcome is not being met or is not as per expectations, then very quickly we tend to withdraw and say, are we doing the right strategy, and so on and so forth. It also there's a lot of environmental factors that's a part of this entire thing. So there's a person who's moving in from early teens to later teens and then moving to adulthood. They have very big decisions that they need to take a risk. Following a profession at sports is still seen as a risk, because if it clicks big, but if it doesn't click, then you don't know where you are. So, and in a field like cricket where there's a huge crowd support that's there, it's not the same in other fields as well. Few people from other choice of game have managed to surface, but the sport as such hasn't come up.
Correct.
So we have recent examples of track and field players, chess players who are coming up and so on, but it is that individual who's coming up. The game per se is not necessarily coming
up because
of this individual.
Team sport, even in a game like football, there are only one or two popular names in Indian cricket, Indian
Correct.
football. I'm saying. Whereas, like you, yeah, brilliant point that, yeah.
Right. So what happens is the risk that it goes into being an athlete really plays in both the player's mind as well as the parents' mind. It doesn't start with the player's mind because the player is still growing, evolving, and all, but it starts with the community in which they're in. So very often, not a lot of people do pursue sport to be able to get into some degree of occupational safety. Like for example, they'll be enrolled into the government, they have those quotas and so on. So they'll play till that point, till they achieve job security, and afterwards their talent does fizzle out. A lot of effort needs to be done by governing bodies to be able to provide more opportunities for sports athletes so that they can continue to pursue that at some degree of variation. If that is not there and it's a very hit or miss kind of situation, it's more likely that potential talent will drop off because the risk is a little too high.
Okay, so we see players. It's a connecting two questions. We see players whose rise is quick, and then when it's quick, we see that two things happen. One, they feel that they belong there and all the aura that's there, and somewhere there is a change in the way they've started approaching the game. That is one thing. Two, there is another set of players whose rise is muted. Both of them have come with performances, but they respond very differently. This person who's risen does not feel that all is not high, but whereas feels that did it happen too suddenly? Did I deserve it? And then they start questioning. So same result, two different kinds of reactions. What do you think is the ideal way that something like this happens? The athletes can handle themselves.
So when there's a sudden growth that happens, either because of the game that they've played or the circumstances they're in, very often it can be very destabilizing. Even if it's a good feeling, it's still destabilizing in that. So we tend to internalize that destabilization in some way. We tend to evaluate it based on whether this is a temporary thing or a permanent thing. If we feel like it's permanent, then very quickly our mindset will change into something else. If we think it's temporary, then we approach that entire thing with some aspects of anxiety, saying, some imposter syndrome as to whether this is, will this actually continue, and so on and so forth. So the approaches are based on this, and it is very externally driven. So in the sense that you'll have more presence, and then suddenly there'll be a gap, or it's very fluctuating. So it depends on which game, which season you're playing, and so on. So if it is very externally driven, that sense of learning to stabilize yourself is very externally driven, then it becomes very, very difficult to cope from the individual, because every day there'll be a different demand. So too much of that can deprioritize what you are actually focusing on, or what your goals are, and so on. So, but if a player is very intrinsically driven, then whatever is happening outside will not deter the individual as much if they're intrinsically driven. So intrinsic motivation is something that really helps help athletes cope with sudden growths or challenges or excitement and so on.
Can we, I as a coach, how do I help players find that?
Okay. So I'll start with a little bit about what intrinsic motivation is. Intrinsic motivation is a firm belief and an internal clarity as to why a person is doing what they're doing. So it comes from various components like knowing or having a sense of meaning for what you're doing, a sense of purpose, an internal enjoyment, a feeling of progression or growth, saying that I'm terming the next set of skills or the next adventure that I'm going through is what's going to help me feel like I'm growing or I'm progressing in life. Then I focus a little bit on the knowledge and the skill elements. I enjoy the fact that I can see myself do better, do things faster, more efficiently. So these are your intrinsic drivers. So intrinsic drivers can be compartmentalized into a couple of headings. One is knowledge acquisition, a sense of freedom that you feel playing a particular game or sport. The next one is a personal growth. And the third one is an ability to engage with the community because of something that I have within me. I'm able to contribute to the growth of knowledge or to share what I like. So these are the different reasons for intrinsic motivation. It's easier to guide because it's all within yourself. So your internal dialogue that is associated with this can help you move forward. So there is extrinsic things that also help validate a lot. So there's like recognition, there's power, there is wealth acquisition that can come from it, there is a lot of adoration that can come. So these are also great, but these are things we can't control. Some days it's there, some days it's not there. In certain regions it's there, certain regions it's not there. So as much as we enjoy it, these are far more temporary than the intrinsic motivation. So learning to develop a very strong internal dialogue as to why you're doing what you're doing and put some degree of purpose into what you're doing will help the athlete go down that path and manage any sort of pressure, expectation, or growth or crisis that the person might feel, and makes them very strong, makes them a lot more balanced and so on, and take adequate decisions to take them forward. So a coach can help remind the player, can help the player explore it and find that meaning for themselves, and also ensure that they are probably the only people in that space to be able to confront a player and say, hey, you know what, something about the way you're looking at it is changing, so you might want to realign or refine yourself. So
how often can this conversation happen? It could probably, when the coach notices something obvious.
Yeah.
What if the change isn't as obvious, but or would you rather structure it?
You should structure it. It also depends on the amount of rapport that the player has with the coach as well. Certain people are comfortable getting feedback from, certain people they may not be comfortable. So it's important that rapport is maintained. Some aspects of developing intrinsic motivation is something that you need to inculcate into the practice and training process earlier, so that you can use that as a template moving forward. You may not always have to confront the player as they're navigating through this, because sometimes we do tend to oscillate between what is it that we want and what we don't. But if you feel like it's taking time off from their plans and their goals, and their efforts are not being put into those spaces, a structured confrontation will help.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.